Welcome everybody to this 1 hour panel discussion. And so the topic is regional and remote research needs, the North Australian perspective. But I hope you'll see that there'll be discussion around a range of topics and you'll see relevance maybe where you least expect it in your own context. So the way we'd like to run it is first I'd like to introduce the panel members, and I know many of you will know them, but I'd like to give them their moment in the sun. They're bringing to the table some really wonderful expertise and really appreciate their contribution. I'm going to pose a couple of questions, and I call it Q&R, really. It's question and response. I think we don't presume to answer some of these bigger questions. We really hope we'll raise more questions. And then we hope that at the end there will be some time for feedback and discussion from the floor. So we'd hope that you could hold your questions, issues, discussion points for them. So I want to make a little comment about the fact that we did ask a fairly new staff member to the university, our Deputy Vice-Chancellor of Indigenous Leadership, Professor Adrian Miller, and he really has a great background in Indigenous community and health service delivery. Unfortunately, he was interstate, so we asked a research fellow from his group, Dr. Cara Beale, and she was planning to fly here and be with us, but she had a death in the family. So I do thank them for their willingness to contribute, but I'm very pleased that we have our four speakers. So starting with David Sheehan, far left. David was appointed to the role of General Manager, Water Quality Performance and Regulation at Coliban Water in February 2014. But prior to that, he worked in a regulatory role with the Victorian Department of Health. He's also currently a member of the National Health and Medical Research Council's Water Quality Advisory Committee. And David has been involved with the Australian water industry for 30 years. David's been a non-executive board director of Water RA since 2014, representing industry members, and currently chairs the Strategic Advisory Committee. Xavier Schobben is Director, Environmental Health at the Environmental Health Branch in the Northern Territory Department of Health, I should know that. His role is to develop and administer relevant public health legislation and policies, and report on all relevant areas to comply with government and agency strategic directions and business plans, including drinking and recreational water quality and waste management. Xavier coordinates the departmental response to major environmental contamination issues, incidents, for example PFAS, asbestos, lead, arsenic, etc. So Xavier is the Northern Territory Department of Health's member representative for Water RA. Steve Capewell is a water quality and treatment specialist whose expertise is planning, design, operation and optimisation of water treatment plants and process technologies to meet safe drinking water quality objectives. He currently heads the Operations Services Group, consisting of water quality treatment and operations support, Safety, Environment and Aboriginal Affairs, and the Statewide Operations Centre at the Water Corporation in WA. Steve is a member of the WA State Advisory Committee for the Purity of Water and the Curtin Water Quality Research Centre Advisory Board. Steve has been a non-executive board director of Water RA since 2013, representing industry members. And Rob Brito has over 22 years' experience in a diverse international career in delivery of essential services for customers in an asset-intensive industry. He has a master's degree in water pollution control engineering from Cranefield Institute in the UK. Robert has confronted common water sector challenges centred around growing population, declining resources, affordability and changing expectations from customers and regulators. Developing strategies and converting them into sustainable outcomes and levels of service accepted by customers and stakeholders alike has become a more common theme across his career. Robert champions technology-led innovation, encouraging water professionals to adopt new ways of thinking and working aligned to vision and goals. Robert is Power and Water Corporation's member representative for RA. So, a wonderful team. Thank you very much. Mumbling? So, I have really just 3 questions this afternoon, and I say I, but the group really put them together. They are weighty issues for North Australia, particularly in the climate in which we find ourselves, not literally, but in this Develop the North agenda that we do have, really building momentum. I look at the Cooperative Research Centre North Australia's themed agenda, and there is a major focus on commodity and agribusiness development in the north. And I really have to wonder about how much the issues of water security have been factored into that thinking around Develop the North. The concept of people on country, or being able to stay on country, requires a reliable supply of water. That's pretty obvious. But it requires water quality that does not contribute to the burden of disease. And it requires water quality sufficient to allow, of sufficient quality to allow treatment, so people can actually stay on country and within their community to run these businesses that we are going to be apparently developing. So those who are making decisions around the direction where North Australia development is going, do they think sometimes about the cost to the community and to the rest of the nation about the fact that people as they age can't stay in place, that they do have to come to the urban centres. People who are unwell have to leave and generally come to urban centres. People who care for them, who could have been themselves working on country, often go with them. There's a social and emotional cost of that loss of people from those communities. And if you're thinking about healthcare and services on country, think about something like renal care, where water of sufficient quality has to be trucked in. That's a huge cost. It's not sustainable. Do we really understand about water in these northern landscapes? We've heard quite a lot of really interesting discussion earlier today from some of our presenters. We talk about sort of easing the burden later on from the distribution system, the water distribution system, and can some of the knowledge we're having about water in our landscape before it even meets the pipes, can we understand a little bit more about easing the burden by avoiding some of these areas that are, for example, high with potentially opportunistic pathogens? So with that lead in, the first of the 3 questions. So there is clear association between diseases, some diseases and infections acquired through poor water quality. From the panel, how can we disrupt this cycle, this nexus between water quality and the burden of disease? How can we reduce the pressure on the distribution supply? And that really doesn't mean turning off the taps. It's really about understanding water in the landscape. And how can we move forward in even more effective and cost-effective water treatment? And I might start by asking Xavier if you'd start.
There's a lot of questions in there. All right. Water is one of the trends of what the rule of threes. So, human being on average can live 3 minutes without air, 3 days without water, 3 weeks without food. And it should be in that order. But, look at food, for instance, on average per year there's about 4.1 million food poisoning events. Most of them are associated with food in the home, but also a lot, unfortunately, that we have to investigate involving environmental health officers of restaurants and takeaways, the rest of the setting. And one of the causes of instance is Capewell. The camp is also associated with water, but we don't have the same bloody count in water supplies as we do, let's say, with food. So I like to think, and we have a number of power and water representatives here, that I think on average it's fairly well managed. For the last 30 years, most of our major towns and indeed 72 major Aboriginal communities are chlorinated. So we do get management by exception, and we do get the need to issue precautionary advice and water board alerts from time to time. But generally speaking, I can honestly say, being 20 years in as director, it's only been a handful of times. So we simply don't have a body count. We do have with Berkeley and even with Area Fowler, we have had instances in our public water supplies and chlorination is taken care of that. That doesn't mean that we can be complacent. I'm not going to speak on behalf of the Department of Health nor the Northern Territory Government. This is just my personal opinion. But I believe that the cost of water is way too cheap. It's around about $2.97 for a kilolitre. And all of us at one stage of no peers, even ourselves, family friends, would go into one of the two major supermarkets and purchase a 600ml bottle of water for $2.50. We are the third cheapest in Australia. I think only bettered by Tasmania, which is about 98 cents a kilolitre, and I think WA is about $1.68. But for me, with all the things that need to be done, including multiple barrier approach, including testing, including training and assessment of essential service operators and everything else, water utilities are government-owned corporations, so they are corporatised but not privatised. So they still are public servants, and to a degree they have to compete with other agencies to get scarce resources to look after what I think is an essential commodity. Water is life. So I would put water in front of food. Unfortunately, food like beef has at the moment grabs all the headlines, and so it's something that we just concentrate on. So, in answer to your question, that's a few of the answers. I think by and large, in Indigenous communities, we're doing our best on our stations. I think we can still do some more work. But, as Bart Carter would attest to, the health status of Aboriginal people on these outstations are far better than they are in urban towns and indeed in some of the major Aboriginal communities because of overcrowding. So I think I'll rest there for the moment. Right.
You've done well. David, would you?
To me, I think the fundamental issue is around capability and capacity building in these communities. We tend to sort of put in technologies and then expect that to sort of solve the problem. Often it needs to be education and capability for those who are going to run these supplies to make sure the chlorinator is always on and the UV system is always working. And then once we get that right, I think it's just some basic education around the link between poor sanitation and waterborne disease. Because I still think a lot of times that connection is made. So wash your hands out together, toilet, all those simple hygiene things that can help break that nexus of disease.
And I think we might also come back to that one later on in the third question as well, about cooperative knowledge. Steve?
So from a water utilities perspective, I mean, we start with the principle that a customer in a remote regional town is as important as a customer in a major urban centre. So that then flows through our planning processes of how we can deliver the same level of service, the same quality, the same quantity to someone in a far-flung part of our state versus someone that's nestled on the banks of the Swan River. The reality, though, is that the practicalities of that, the costs associated with that, the sheer nature of those geographic locations makes it a totally different ballgame to providing services in the city to those areas. And I think we, for a long time, have had a glide path of trying to close that gap between metro and regional. And the way that I think is the best way to approach regional is to start with, simply understanding the risk, understanding the barriers that we've got to put in place to manage the risk, because you asked that question about how do we break that cycle. And then what are the sensible investments to be able to ensure that we can reliably and robustly sort of deliver that outcome. And from my perspective, those solutions in those regional and remote towns, the questions are a technology question and secondly an operating model question. And I don't think that either ourselves in the West Northern parts of Australia, I don't think we've quite nutted that just yet. But if we're starting from that basic principle of everyone deserves a clean, safe water supply, then I think we can engage and we can elicit support on the basis of that premise.
So before I leave you, what about my comments right at the beginning that when you think about a multi-million-dollar CRC North Australia where water really doesn't figure in the conversation, and we're talking about the cost of water and investment, and we're not getting signals to say if you're working in water, come up and apply for a program within the CRC.
Yeah, and I think that's probably part of what needs to change. I think that's the conversation that we need to initiate. I mean, what we're doing here today is very much part of that.
I think it's also the luxury we have where we don't have a lot of waterborne outbreaks in Australia, and there's a complacency that water's already sorted out, and somehow will just magically appear without being part of that broader conversation about how important it is to the fundamentals.
Oh, particularly in the remote context, I mean, the first presentation talks about that number of deaths in a regional and remote location. If that was on the banks of the Swan River in Perth,
If we change the conversation just to look at what happened in Sydney in 98, no one died, but Sydney water $300 million.
Rob?
Yeah, just adding to what Steve said around levels of service, around safe, secure water supplies. I'd also add upon that water that's good to drink. You know, so some regulation frameworks, associated with drinking water directives that are legally binding, talk about wholesomeness of water. So they give equal weight to the safety component as well as water that's good to drink. And immediately when you give the same priority to risks around microbial contamination as well as chemical anesthetics, you start to move towards a minimum level of service for all. Some countries have differing levels of service for rural versus urban. We thankfully don't have that in Australia. But once you establish your minimum level of service, it then frames a conversation around how you're going to achieve that. And then you start to move into maybe turning on its head the commercial model. How are you going to fund it? How is it going to become affordable? And then all agencies, you start to move towards integrated planning, and it drives everyone in the same path, I guess. So water that's good to drink, I think, is just as valid. But we understand our risks, and we're taking a risk-based approach, which is in compliance with the Australian. What did I do?
Well, just on that point, though, I think when we talk about North Australia, I think in HMRC encourages people to drink eight glasses of water a day, twice about 2 litres, all right? So the methodology that the HMRC use in developing a health threshold guideline from the guidelines is usually total daily intake multiplied by 70 kilogram per person multiplied by the percentage of that exposure pathway of that parameter divided by 2 litres of water a day. Now I would challenge anybody living in Northern Territory that they can survive just on 2 litres of water a day in remote communities. Situations I think you know that. In fact, when you look at the emergency advice provided by police and indeed by ourselves, should a cyclone happen, we base it on 4 litres of water to drink per person per day. So to some extent, you've got to turn the guidelines on their head, because unfortunately, as we're finding out in those people are just enamored with numbers. And I think the issue is there needs to be some flexibility and some scope. Even though you've got built-in safety factors, nonetheless, as you know, Karen, one of my bugbears is I don't know really how much water people drink in remote communities. We're assuming somewhere between 1 to 3 litres, but we don't know. And I think that's one of the challenges for us, is to say, we're dealing with water which is delivered hot, we're dealing with water that sometimes tastes too salty or too minerally because of hardness or TDS or whatever. So people avoid drinking the water, they go to other beverages which are high in sugar, etc., and that leads to overweight and obesity, etc., and breathing injuries and all the rest of it. So I think part of that pattern is really trying to establish truth and proof, establish the baseline. How much are people drinking, and how can we encourage people? Is it through chilled water fountains, next to the community store, in the school, etc.? How do we encourage that? because in just answering the first question, renal diseases like this, it's almost linear, and it's got a huge cost for health and the health budget. What's happening now, because the PACS, patient assisted travel, which is very expensive, it doesn't do community members any justice either, because they have to travel from their remote community to the big smoke, where they feel uncomfortable, etc. So there's a lot more emphasis now being placed on providing renal dialysis in communities. On average, they use 150 litres of purified water through reverse osmosis units in a session. Most patients need about 4 sessions a week. So there's a demand of 600 litres per person additionally for purified water with respect to renal. And that's only going to be on the increase. At the moment, we have about a dozen. I can see in the next 10 to 20 years of every remote community, we have 72. All those that have a health clinic will probably have a wing dedicated to renal.
Right, are we ready to move on? Thank you. It actually, something that you said before about how much water people drink, that sort of segues to really the commentary around water scarcity in parts of Northern Australia. And so particularly vulnerable, I suspect, to the very young and the very old. And this is still on that narrative around the well-being of the community, and where there is water scarcity. Do you have any comments around the fact that we're really not appreciating the fact that when parents don't want to bathe their children because there's so little water, that's actually manifesting in skin disease transfer when they're sleeping together in beds, as little kids do, and adding to the stress for elderly people, so that morbidity is sort of pushed, in the middle age rather than at the other end. So water scarcity as a really big agenda issue. Are we really doing enough to make sure that's on the agenda? David?
I think you picked me out of a controversial response. It makes me wonder whether, in some cases, if there's not water there, whether the community should exist. And that's a hard one, because obviously we're saying that a lot of these Indigenous communities have a very strong sense of place, and you'd like them to stay there. But if they can't have it, if that site doesn't have enough water for basic human needs, then really is a place for setting up a community. Tough on that one. I'm not sure what the answer is.
That might be something that someone in the audience wants to pick up right now. All right, we'll break with tradition.
Same comment on the desal plants in Sydney and Melbourne. So water's body points, set a population limit, but who's going to go there? What engineer's going to say, here's the limit, you deal with it?
So it's a challenging one.
So, and any engineer will say, no worries, we'll get water there somehow.
And then it becomes that cost trade-off about servicing for community, large cost who pays. Often the community's capacity to pay will be limited. So how do you then come with a model that allows people to stay in place, have the basic needs they need, and have a sustainable community? There's no easy answer to that. I'm not suggesting you should shut communities down, but it's a difficult one in the long term.
Rob Brito's got an excellent case study with respect to PFAS and Catherine. Rob, would you like to extol the dude?
I'm not suggesting you should shut
You are cheeky. I'm gonna go to the scarcity question that you're asking, and then I'm PFAS out at the moment. It's been a challenging week. So on the scarcity question, I do think that when we come to infrastructure planning within remote communities, that availability, sustainable sources needs to be front and centre in that planning process. Needs to be absolutely integrated within infrastructure planning. And it's about availability, water availability, both in terms of quality and quantity. And certainly we need to do an awful lot more around system losses, valuing that water, understanding, Xavier talked about trying to understand usage and consumption and managing demand. and getting out and educating communities and customers around usage, demand where necessary, having demand management in place. But actually, we have a lot of responsibility on our side as the water industry to manage system losses as well. Ultimately, to deliver sustainable resource and extend its availability. So I think we can do an awful lot more.
So to that point, Karen, the interesting experience we have in WA is that in the northern part of the state, source yield is a major issue for us. The scarcity question is certainly there. But what happens is you have a low yield, but then you're putting in treatment technologies where you have very high waste. So reverse osmosis, half of what you put in, 60% of what you put in, 40% will lose as waste. And so there's a solution set there that considers scarcity of source, treatment technology to deliver your water quality outcomes, and you want to make that thing balanced. So I think that's one of the most complex planning problems that the water industry currently has, is how to tick those boxes for consistent product, consistent supply, meeting water quality drivers, which we've heard from this afternoon, are quite complex in their own right, in driving new technology and then seeing an operating model across the top of it.
And I think there are links between reducing quantity of water and deteriorating quality. So if you don't address the scarcity issue, quality can be impacted, and then you're talking about more complex, costly treatment solutions. So it's almost a vicious circle in a way.
And again,
it's integrated thinking.
Again, in the small communities that often have a limited capacity to pay for that service.
I think too, Karen, that it's not just remote communities. There's this misnomer that the top end is full of water and it rains for 3.5 months and it's dry as bone after that. We have shocking usage rates across the whole of the territory, up to 1,000 litres per person per day. In Melbourne it's down to 155, other areas a little lower, but we just use it illegally. And I think some of the demand management strategies, and I'm not suggesting for a moment that we issue water restrictions across the board, but I do think there needs to be an education campaign where we raise the price of water, so there's a price of electricity, or meant to educate people. And in answer to your question about water scarcity, political cycles run on 4 years. It would be a brave cabinet that would say, "Oh, we're going to relocate the community."
Yeah,
absolutely.
that's going to come back to you, David, several times, I suspect. No, let's leave that one. We've still got a few questions to go. I can't not answer.
Sorry,
Yes, please.
it refers to a couple of things there. One is, we have the same problem with the same water, and we're dealing with the APY lands. And again, we have low source waters, sometimes poor quality. And like our response to we're putting RO in an increasing number of places, and we go for a dual reticulation now. So you've got a drinking water tap over the sink. If we've got reasonable yields, we'll also have the hot water services. But the rest of the house will be plumbed with just straight raw water. And we have very little waste streaming, because waste streaming goes back into Shanding. And the other one, we have the same problem. We get told, God, there's going to be another 20 houses going in. We're going, hang on, we haven't got enough water for the 400 people there. How are we going to give water for another 150 people? And we don't have control over that. We can't sit there and go, no. And I think it's different too, relocating communities, just saying, you can't be any bigger, guys.
Even in a regional context, urban context, I mean, the perception that the resource is infinite, and that you just add more houses, add more people will be fine. And there's that distinction between planning and water utilities, and those things don't often align, unfortunately.
I think, bringing it back, there'll be time. I think it'd be great to have a discussion. I'd really like to see if we could finish off this last bit. But the other thing I'll just throw in there around what's still disturbing me about, I guess, the Develop the North agenda is with the cattle industry, I think a conversation also should be had about water credits. And so people running cattle or not managing feral animals on country who do not fence or protect really scarce water supplies there is just nothing in place to require that. And so if we could eventually back to the ecology and water in the landscape, which is a parallel issue. So the thing that I really want to get to before I open it up is one of the things I find quite perplexing is in thinking about remote communities and the voice of the traditional owners and the elders within those communities and within their complex governance, which many of us don't understand around communities. I think that we don't do well enough understanding the knowledge structures and flow of information, who has the currency of wisdom in those communities, who should we be communicating with when we approach communities, what is their story about water, how do we co-own the issue with them? So you might have heard both ways knowledge, traditional and scientific knowledge. There are two knowledge systems, but it's almost impossible without a voice of a group like this alongside researchers standing up and saying we need to understand, appreciate, interpret, and both own the issues, because when we put those sorts of requests forward to funding bodies, it never gains traction. And I'd like to know, do you have a view on how, as an industry, can we make sure that will gain traction, would be taken seriously, and would get funded? That's cooperative knowledge research, so that we, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous people concerned about these issues, are supported to do something about it.
Yeah, happy to start off on that one. So, going back to the point around urban versus rural, remote communities, certainly in recent times, in recent years, we're talking more and more to customers in urban centres. We're hearing their views, their preferences, their priorities, and we're testing acceptability around business plans, around levels of service. That equivalent type of conversation should be happening with all customers going forward. And of course, customers, I've worked with customers in communities that have entirely different beliefs and value systems when it comes to water and the environment. And back to the question around the territory and remote communities, we have to have those conversations. We have to listen. We have to build in. We have to educate. We have to build in their views and their considerations. And a really good example, I don't work day in, day out in regions and remote. Nigel gave you a really good example, if you don't mind, on Barunga and the customer engagement process you went through on that. Would you like to share that?
Yeah, sure. Barunga was a good example. It's one of our most exposed communities in terms of the risk from the surface water source. So we'd identified that something needed to be done to change the source. We'd already got an identified underground source. We're slightly different to the main PwC in the fact that we worked through a government agency, through the department. So the department led the engagement with that community to say, okay, great news, we're moving over from the unsafe surface water source and we're moving to a pore water source. And really the response from the community was one of horror, to say, well, we hate pore water. Pore water's horrible. We've been to other places. There's several, but there's places where the pore water's high salts, high TDS, and it just doesn't taste very palatable. So their perception immediately was, we're not having a pore water source. We want to carry on drinking the water we know. We like it. It's fine. This is despite the fact that we can see buffalo swimming in that water source every day and pooing in it. So we need to move away. We don't have multiple barriers there. We just have coarse filters and chlorination. chlorination. And so, the next step was to get several, a big group of, both scientists and our engagement people to go down there and talk to the people and actually we actually went to the extent of pumping the bore source and we put some chlorine in to make sure it was still safe to drink. But we took that into the next community meeting and we gave them a glass of that water to drink and said, well, this is what we're going to be giving you. And we also gave them a picture to show them that actually this is the same water you get out of that spring. It's just that it comes up higher up the catchment. We're taking it out in the ground before the buffalo get to it. Same water, that it's all good. And, the two things, being able to present a picture that shows them where the water's coming from and let them taste it, the community have been very much on board with that since then.
That's a good story. Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, I also came to similar. I think that conversation has already started. If you went back 5, 8, 10 years, there was the planning formula in the bottom drawer, the planner pulled out and he just sort of went through his process to deliver an upgrade to a water supply or an upgrade to a sewage works. I think through all of the major water utilities, through their water security plans or stories, I think you'll see sprinkled in each of them a pretty robust and expansive engagement strategy that is looking to segment their customers, understand what those customer expectation needs, wants, desires are. Not that we can fulfil all of them as a water service provider, but certainly taking on board a lot of those considerations. I don't think it's perfect yet. It's certainly not perfect in a regional and remote context, but I think it's certainly on the glide path.
Xavier.
Don't underestimate Aboriginal people. The issue is we have power water, don't we? Water stories, which are irrelevant. So it's diagrammatic representation of where the water comes from, how much there is, etc., what it's currently used for, how much is leaking, all the rest, etc. And they might take a bit more time to can, distill, the idea would come back, but the elders in particular and the government structure in the communities, do take to that, they do understand it. And as Nigel said, sometimes it comes from left field. You think you're doing the right thing, but in fact, it's aesthetics. It's people advertise, irrespective of the risk. So it's important that we encapsulate that. And I think, as I said, Barry was in some great work with the Darwin water stores, and I've seen some plans also with respect to what they do with remote communities, particularly where we have, let's say, high nitrates, as we do in Kintor, etc., that causes blue baby syndrome, the blood anemia. And other areas where we've got high amounts of uranium and what have you. So I think it's imperative that we do consult with the community in a cultural appropriate manner, and sometimes that means also bringing interpreters from different language groups that are present there, and don't underestimate the quietest person in the room is most often the most powerful. So it's really important that they give them time to consider and that their views are taken on board.
I would even, before I pass to you, David, I'd even go further, and it's not just about, in my mind, the comment on this is that teaching people to understand what you want them to understand and then have them do what you want them to do. It's actually maybe even earlier on exploring an understanding of water in the landscape, because I'm sort of still back there in the escarpment, and having an understanding of how we can actually reduce the burden of water quality demands on the actual water supply system. So how would you feel, for example, I'll go back to Xavier before I hand to you, David, is that you really wanted something done, you really wanted something dealt with because you were worried about implications for health, but the community really had a different spin on it. I mean, do you have strategies for ways of actually just not, when it doesn't go the way you expected? Like, how do you hear their story?
I think as a health regulator, we work under a Western paradigm. But once you have knowledge, the clock starts ticking, and the Ombudsman and the Public Interest Disclosure Commissioner and everybody else, etc., to who knew when, why, what. But I think when you're dealing particularly with Aboriginal people and communities, we talk about self-determination, right? And I think sometimes we pay lip service to it. So I think part of it is that as a health regulator, we still have a responsibility of providing people with safe water, but we need to explain how that comes about. And I think, as Nigel said before, that was a great way of doing it. So. Look, there is no one plan fits all, all right, because of different cultural groups and songlines and kinship, etc. It's different. You can't use Walbury and Tigoma, etc., etc. They're all diverse, they're all different. But I think, as I said, don't underestimate their ability to understand things. And even though you're pushing for a safe water outcome, it can be achieved through different means. Initially, when we talked about Barunga, we were talking about putting a fence around the catchment area to stop the buffalo from wallowing in there. But then we had complications because we won't say that it was, but a particular person didn't like the fact that somebody would be in their helicopter shooting the buffalo or whatever because they might get the job. You know what I mean? So, and we had a similar situation, and I won't say which community and all the rest of it years ago. We were desperately trying to get chlorination through, but one power broker in the community said, no, it affects the taste of homebrew. So for the next 3 years we tried to fight and we rejoiced in that. But expect the unexpected. That's just the power plays in.
David?
I feel rather underqualified to talk on this one because we don't, Coliban doesn't service any Indigenous communities. But one of the things that's happened in Victoria is that in our state government policy around water, there's a lot strong element around the cultural aspects of water and how that relates to traditional owners. And I think that's probably something that needs to be valued as well, is what their story is in their relationship with the water supply is, and how you factor that into the planning, because there may be something significant about where you want to go and place your water source or change the water source. And that just takes time to work through that issue as well.
Thanks, David. I've got the eye. Rob?
I do still think there's a bit of an elephant in the room. So we agree that engagement and listening and building up a preferred plan together to deliver safe, secure water. And we agree that a minimum level of service is what but then how do you afford it all? What's the funding model? And I kind of feel that one has to turn on its head our operating model and our commercial models that we use today and going forward. And I don't know how the regulatory framework sits across that to drive that thinking and that priority around funding and getting those minimum levels at the right time. But anyway.
And before we throw it open, I just wonder, I'm sure this has been done, I'm just not aware of it, the cost to the nation and the Northern Territory government of disrupting communities and not having decentralised health services. We should be factoring that in when we're making our argument. And even if we thought that we could attempt a decentralised health service with renal care on country as a case study and discuss that possibility alongside the cost to having to bring people in from these areas, and then the cost to the community in ways that you can't always measure in hard dollars. So, are there any final comments from the panel? I really appreciate. Sorry.
Can I just say that I think there is a complacency with respect to water safety across Australia, and I do believe I used to say, if we don't do this, people will die. And we've done nowadays. If we don't do this, people will die. But how many? And so the issue is that I think we need to reinvent it with respect to what John Snowden by taking the handle up Broadside Pump and Xavier when we get caught. I think we've become anaesthetised as a community group with respect to, and as you said, Dave, I think the switch electricity comes on, the light comes on, all the rest of it, and air conditioning and the remote TV, And when we turn the tap, we don't give a second thought. We expect to see colourless liquid coming out of that tap. And why do we try if that's not the case? So I think to a degree there needs to be really a re-emphasis on the safety of water and what it actually costs to deliver it properly across the board. And that includes health regulators, water utilities, central agencies, all having a common picture as to that's what it costs because it's essential, just like indoor air quality.
And as someone that's just returned back to Australia 13 months ago, working under a very stringent drinking water directive, where there were no ambiguities, I do feel that sometimes there are some ambiguities in the guidelines, especially around the aesthetics. I feel there's some ambiguities, so complacency. But yes, so yeah, I think ambiguities also.
Hi, I have a question for Xavier. Can you talk to how water quality is regulated in 72 communities that are provided by Power Water?
Sure,
Can you talk about the link between regulation and funding and meeting guidelines? Just interested in.
Okay, so under section 46C of the Water Supply and Sewerage Services, the Minister for Health has the ability to set water quality standards. We have a problem with the word standards because that has a legal connotation. Right? So a standard, say under the Food Standards Code, under the Food Act, means you cannot exceed it. So you have a maximum for food, for lead in fish and all the rest. You can't sell it. Whereas in water, we have a memorandum of understanding with Power Water, so at the highest level, so that we say, we pick up the Australian Drinking Water Guidelines and say, this is what we need to achieve. You need to legislate and establish trigger values. So if you're getting close to 1.5 milligrams per litre with respect to, let's say, fluoride in Town Creek, all right, let us know when it gets to 1.2, etc., because we may need contingencies. And that's much the same with some of the other chemical parameters under the Drinking Water Guidelines. So it's really MOU. We're thinking about adopting a formula with the Public Environmental Health Act, like we have, let's say, with the recreational water quality, which are also ordained by the NHMRC. And that means that it's not just the monopoly utility like Power Water, but also the other utilities like Gemco and Alendor, like Rio Tinto and etc., so that they are also covered by the Chief Health Officer that's formally adopting this drinking water guidelines.
But I think the question is, can they compel water utility?
Well, I was interested, I mean, in WA, as you know, so I work with Steve at the Water Corporation. There isn't any regulation at the moment for water quality in remote Aboriginal communities.
Yes.
So I was just curious as to the model in the NT, if they are, you mentioned Tennant Creek.
Yeah.
I mean, in Aboriginal communities in the 72, is there regulation?
We only have, and this is ironic because Power and Water Corporation are broken up into water services and Indigenous essential services. Right, so the IES look after the 72 major Aboriginal communities, but we still treat them the same as we would with water services. The only way we can really regulate is by issuing emergency advice, that is water level. All right? And we work with them with a management plan with ongoing testing, etc., to see very hotspots.
Thank you.
You've been waiting.
Yeah, well, I thought there's a few of the discussions we just had, and I might want to just put a plug in for the CSC for Water Sensitive Cities that I'm working for, and maybe for my talk tomorrow. Some people who will be there tomorrow morning. Is that all focused around community and social capital, or whatever you want to call it? Because I think it's quite interesting to see, for example, the Victoria Water Plan now has community smack bang in the middle as the centre of the universe, in a sense, of water. Everything around water has to focus on, which is fine, and I think that's actually the objective. But one of the things, and that probably would address a number of these challenges, because in many ways the challenges, the issues in the remote situations are fundamentally quite different to the urban, but in many ways the approaches could be quite similar. It's no different if we try to sell a community in a city the recycled water, potable recycled water option
And if we don't do it right, we end up with billions of stranded assets, which we have. Indeed, I know too well about that. And that's actually, in some ways, again, the same issue, because we did not bring the community along, we didn't actually communicate, and we didn't actually build that social capital. And I think one of the things we've learned out of some of the research in the CRC from early stages is that the level of literacy in the community around water is very low. And it's shocking, even in places like Queensland, where we have a lot of debates or whatever, we get sort of an average measure of about 20% of the community has reasonable literacy around water. That's the whole community, mostly in the urban space.
The only bonus was that Victoria was only half that, so we're feeling better than twice as good as Melbourne, but besides that, it's still ridiculously low. And I think that's part of the problem, that we've got to raise that level of awareness, the level of knowledge, the level of understanding. And once you do that, and we've had a number of cases now where, it was literally yesterday, I talked to Ian Lowell, maybe you know him. He's just been involved in a workshop in Maroochydore, just up the road from Brisbane, and they had a community group of 150 people that had to make decisions, so play money, as to where and how to invest their money for upgrading their water supply or whatever. And they ended up actually going, the vast majority, for potable recycling options, once they understood the solutions and the benefits and the values and whatever. And so it just shows how much you can actually work with the community rather than sort of thinking, oh, well, they're the people out there, we just got to provide a service to them. And I think that's the attitude needs to sort of change and have community centered. And then I think a lot of those issues can be addressed, similar to what we said. Work with them and figure out what are their concerns and then address the concerns rather than just say, no, this is safe water, believe me. So I think that's the sort of general approach that we've tried to actually, and the same goes back to the planning. I mean, if people say, well, there's going to be another 150 people with 150 houses there, how do you actually work with the community to say, well, okay, if we want to get that, how do we manage demand? How do we manage the losses? How green has the law to be?
In answer to your question earlier about does anyone actually analyse the costs, the feds have, the federal government has, they have that information of exactly what it costs, and you were talking before about the rental care and all that sort of thing. There's a huge amount of money through the Closing the Gap program the federal government puts in through the primary health networks, the Aboriginal medical services, where they fund Indigenous outreach workers and health promotion officers. I think if you can start to collaborate with the federal department, through your primary health networks that are established, your Aboriginal medical services that are actually set up around the place, you can start to assist with a lot of that education and training, but you're also going to access that information on how much it's actually costing the community, and then as a joint promotion, and I've been bold enough to suggest that between the Northern Territory Department of Health, the Federal Department of Health, and even industry could actually start to put together some fairly strong business cases.
Just addressing your problem about engagement, how do we work with communities to talk about water issues? There's a water research project at the moment about how do we assessing, understanding and developing understandings about people's perceptions of water quality that's underway now. And that's about aesthetics, taste and odour and other things. And although that was designed around the major water utilities and how they engage with customers, we're coming to the end of that project and we want to add on rural, remote and Indigenous communities. And so there's still a potential, and I'd love to talk to anyone while I'm here for the next few days about to actually interview them and capture that. Where can we go from here? Because that could be the next step of, there's a whole toolbox of engagement methodologies that we've developed and we can tweak them now to make them more relevant to rural remote.
We've got very little time left, and I'd like to hand to you, and we might go into time here. Yes.
No, I'm just wondering, we're talking about the water crisis in Darwin and how it needs to go up and develop in the north. But in the event, obviously, I'm from Ireland and I left Ireland in the height of the recession. We have our own Indigenous community there. First thing that happened when the recession hit, the government had no contingency plans in to support our Indigenous people. So with that, with the prize developing the north, changing government every 4 years, what is have we considered our contingency plans to support our remote communities in the event of economic downfall or economic downturn?
Great question. Normally there's to call the CSO, helping out the money.
Yeah, so 60-40.
Yeah, and that CSO, yeah, 60-40. But that's not owned by the utility or even by the health regulator, that's owned by Treasury. So they give out, if you like, to other agencies. So they negotiate this with the utility, and we have some oversight over it. As I said, just on David, it would be a very great government, particularly here, where, as you know, we are the smallest jurisdiction, but we get, even though that severely cut in GST revenue, we still get a decent slice of the GST pie based on the pay factor. All that has to do with Aboriginal communities. So I don't think, like Ireland, recession, we had that here too, and certainly Victoria that I recall, but I don't think they would be the first things to be considered.
One of the good things about the Australian Woods at the moment is it's still all public owned. Yeah. So there's no, they're not a great profit owner, obviously you never turn a profit. But the fact is that we end up becoming lenders of last resort pretty much. So government can still direct us to sort of say you must supply water of this quality and we'll be bankrolled for that. So I couldn't see a situation where we would abandon communities because of the time of that.
Well, actually, what's caused uproar in Ireland, probably being not correctly, or is the fact that Irish people have to pay for their water.
Yeah. It's all sort of similar in New Zealand at the moment too.
Let's make this the right question because your drinks are getting warm.
I don't know exactly the question. It was just coming from what Xavier said about imposing white collar standards, but also imposing technical standards. It's the same type of problems. Things I've found, I guess other people found the same. First problem is chasing canyons. In that if we just pump the water out of the ground, throw it down a pipe, and people go and drink it, huge percentage of the time, nothing's going to go wrong. So it's very hard to convince people that there's this death lurking in the pipe. And then we've got to look from the standard, we're getting a 0 to hero culture. We've got fluoride at 3 and you can easily get it down to 2. Yes, so that's not good enough because it's got to be 1.5. Well, it's a huge improvement. Let's accept a huge improvement and then keep working towards that 1.5. And the last one's the old catchphrase of, what's the value of human life? Well, you've got a $5 million budget and there's 2,500 people, it's $2,000 a person. And there's no escape in that. I don't know if you guys see that how it all comes together or falls apart depending on how you manage it.
I think just on that, I think one of the things South Australia's been moving away for a while, their health and all policies. And I think, something before, we're building a lot more houses, and unfortunately, what we're finding at Aboriginal communities is that we're getting an aging population, but we've got a lot of youngsters, under 21. So the issue is we can, from a housing perspective, we're barely keeping up with the backlog, let alone the growth. So there's only going to be more and more demands on housing infrastructure and supply. But I love the thing, and that was a tag for Brito, what they did basically in Catherine, we won't mention the P word, but they've decreased from 15 million litres of water consumed by Catherine down to 9.5 by yes, the water restriction, but also living smart, leak detections and all the rest of it. People save money. It's a double barrel approach.
We've got smart meters and that nature links everywhere.
And those demand side options is Catherine in a out of normal business as usual situation. We're very much applying those demand side options across other parts of the territory. Darwin will start very soon. But your point, we've got to run a commercially sustainable business. We're a government-owned corporation. We've got to pay a fair return back to the shareholder. Got to keep the economy running. So we've got to deliver affordable services, meet those minimum levels of service that we've talked about around water quality and sustainable supplies. But also got to run efficiently. So we're running a business.
Yeah, I appreciate that, but just the final point is that we are an industry body and we are all in this together. And I think sometimes we've done join forces to try to put things on their heads and apply for money to actually try different things. So let's continue to work together. It's not just a corporation by itself. These guys have worked really hard, and so have you. Thanks for